My name is Kali Akuno, um, and you're joining us today for one of our ongoing monthly lecture series around the ecology, climate, and race. But we cover a lot more than that in our discussions with the Institute of Social Ecology, which is hosting these series and today's conversations. And today I am pleased to bring on an old friend and comrade, Ismail Kush, um, who is a Sudanese American, uh, uh, profound journalist. And I don't say that lightly just because I know him, but I would encourage you to look at, you all to look at some of the media coverage he's done over the years. To educate yourselves about a number of international issues which don't often get much coverage or play in the United States, unfortunately. And that leads us into, I just want to go directly into our conversation, today, which is, there are a number of pressing conflicts that are happening in the world today, from the ongoing ethnic cleansing and genocide we are all unfortunately witness to in Palestine, to the war raging in the Ukraine, to the total destabilization of Haiti, which it looks like, for folks who are aware today, it looks like the actual kind of U.S., let's call it what it is, invasion or seizure of at least the airport and some strategic assets around the country is happening today for them to kind of move in the next puppet government. Let's just call that what it is. That's actually happening right now as we speak. But today we really want to focus in on the Sudan. And this is a struggle that is uh, very dear to me for a number of different reasons, but it's one I can say unequivocally should be at the top of everyone's radar because of the scale and scope, and I believe the international impact that it has. But it is being severely undercovered in the U.S. media, and to a greater degree, I would say the Western media. The news source I see that at least a mainstream source that seems to be giving it the most coverage is the German DW network. You can find that in English, but most of that coverage I think is severely biased, a Western bias that we can kind of get into today. But we really wanted to highlight and elevate this to talk about the broad kind of dynamics of this particular struggle, um, why it's happening, the history, background, and then the international dimensions of this, which are many, that I think we need to talk about and be aware of, because the world is shifting very rapidly before our eyes, and we're not quite clear where this is headed. I think all of us need to be clear about that. But we need to figure out ways to act in solidarity with each other for just causes across borders. But we need to be very clear about what the struggles are, and that can be very confusing in this day and age, when everything is not as it was, say, in the 20th century, often so ideologically focused or ideologically aligned or stated political platforms. We live in a different age where that's not often as clear. So you can kind of say, I support this one, or this is the good guy because of this view, or this is the bad guy because of that view. It's far more complicated, and we got to get into the nuances of the complications because they've always been there. And I think the Sudan is one of those issues where how the state was constructed basically it kind of set up a lot of the dynamics that we are witnessing right now, and unfortunately people are living through. Um, and hopefully we'll do more of these. We're not going to cover everything in one conversation about this, nor was that was the intent. So I hope folks stay with us. But the first thing I just want to do is just turn it over to you, Ismail, and why don't we just start? Because as we did the beginning, uh, I have a series of questions in the outline so folks know on where we want to go and just kind of give a historical background. But as we were coming on, Ismail was talking about, the personal dynamics. And I think I'd like for you to just give an opening about what you want to share off the top, and then we kind of get into questions. But, just bring to us, if you can, how real this is. So folks, don't just get an academic sense of it, but a real concrete sense of what's going on.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I mean, first, thank you, Kali, and thank you to the Institute of Social Ecology for organizing this event. As Kali mentioned, we go way back, early 90s, UC Davis. And, it's amazing to still be in contact with all friends and comrades, and, and these, our paths intersect at these, on these issues. Um, I think, let me begin just giving some background on how we got here. Um, um, or the conflict that is raging right now in Sudan, which started on April 15th of last year, 2023, and which has led to the displacement of nearly 9 million people. About 1.5 million are refugees abroad in Sudan, mostly in neighboring countries in Egypt, in Chad, and South Sudan, and Ethiopia, and elsewhere. Um, and with the death of at least 15,000 people, probably double or triple of the number, given that we don't really have accurate assessments with internet outages, electricity outages. It's still, we don't really know what the actual death total is, but it is really possibly the largest humanitarian catastrophe at the moment, especially with a famine. I mean, the official statements of international organizations, talk about a looming famine. The famine is already there. The famine is happening in different parts of Sudan. So, I mean, to give some background of how we got here, um, Sudan, since its independence in 1956 from joint British Egyptian rule, what was known as the Anglo Egyptian Condominium, since 1956 has witnessed 18 military coup attempts, 18, the highest in Africa and in the region. 6 of those military coups were successful, 3 leading to military dictatorship, and 3 leading to siding to with popular uprisings or revolutions. I mean, the question of how to rule Sudan, and what kind of government to rule Sudan and to deal with the various issues that the country has been dealing with since its establishment, since the beginnings of its formation in the 19th century have been an issue. The issues such as what kind of relationship would Sudan have with Egypt? Should it be an independent country? Should it be a part of Egypt? The place of Islamic law, how to deal with diversity, what kind of cultural and educational issues, issues of unequal development that go back to colonial rule and linger on even in the independence government. These are the issues that are the source of Sudan's instability. In, as a reflection of this of the difficulties of how to govern and manage Sudan. In 2011, South Sudan voted in a referendum to split from the north and become its own country. And I think with that, I mean, that was a reflection, I think, of the failure of the central government in Khartoum to deal with issues of development, to deal with issues of ethnic and cultural diversity, to establish a truly democratic government and system that would allow for the input of different groups throughout the country and different political outlets. I mean, the diversity is not just a matter of ethnic or religious or cultural, but also political outlooks from left to right. I mean, how do you establish an entity that allows for that, and how? I mean, do the political actors have that political culture um, that allows for various opinions where the barrel of the gun and tanks don't become the decisive factor in establishing governments. As I mentioned, I mean, 18 military coup attempts since 1956. I mean, if you compare it to Sudan's neighbors, it's just a striking um, difference. The government of Omar al-Bashir, the opposed government in 2019, had ruled Sudan for 30 years, coming to power in 1989, with an Islamist political outlook. For 30 years, the country had been either suffered from political instability at its center in Khartoum or in conflicts or because of conflicts in different regions in South Sudan, and then later in Darfur. Discontent with the central government, with the government of Bashir, is what pushed Sudanese, especially Sudanese youth, in late 2018 and early 2019 to 4 months of protest that led to the ousting of Bashir. It wasn't the first attempt to oust Bashir. There had been many attempts, either by rebel movements in different parts of the country or through uh, nonviolent action and protest through trade unions, through university students. But this particular one, this last revolution, so to speak, of course, Sudan has had three popular uprisings in its history. The first in the region in 1964, and then in 1985, and then again in 2019. The Sudanese revolution led to the ousting of Bashir, and then um, you had this, which was spearheaded by what was known as the Sudanese Professionals Association, the SPA, which was a coalition of trade unions. In Sudan's history, excuse me, in 1964, trade unions always played an important role in Sudanese politics. In 2018 and 2019, these independent trade unions that brought professionals, doctors, journalists, um, teachers were able, I think, for the first time in a long time, put aside their differences and mobilize the streets. Um, the ousting of Bashir didn't mean the actual removal of Bashir's government. You still had the military establishment, the security apparatus, and quote unquote, the deep state. In front of the army headquarters, Sudanese youth had established a camp um, demanding the surrender of power to a coalition of political parties, of civilian political parties that became known as the Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC. Um, the 2 month encampment in front of army headquarters was met um, 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 with a disbursement on June 3rd, 2019, and the killing of at least 125 protesters and the disappearance of scores. That led to more protest and then to a signing of an agreement between the civilians and the military. and the establishment of a transitional period that was supposed to last for 3 years and lead to elections in 2023. There were difficulties with this transitional period. We can get into the details in the discussion. But at the end of the day, the military establishment with its various branches, the army, the rapid support forces, which is a paramilitary established by the army to fight in far regions such as Darfur and such as South Sudan. The military establishment in more than one incident uh, truly showed that it was not serious about turning over rule to the civilian coalition. Again, the massacre of June 3rd, the coup of October 25th, 2021, and between 2021 and then last year, 2023, April 2023, there were attempts to reach an agreement between the civilians and the military, and it seemed like early April that there was an agreement, but that then you know this conflict between the army, the rapid and the rapid support forces broke out, and not to forget that the impact, the influence of the deposed government that never really left power, but was still in state institutions. You know, the so-called deep state was always there. So and this is where we are today. I mean, this was the worst case scenario. I think that many of us had feared, that fighting between the two branches of the military establishment, which would lead to the situation that we have today. I
Well,
understand
thank you.
there are a lot of details and acronyms that we can get, but we can get into this. Yeah.
No, thank you for that. That was, I think, good and covered a lot of things very, very quickly. So I hope folks followed up on that. If I can, I'd like you to speak now, particularly for this audience, about the role of U.S. interference with the transitional process and with the transitional government. You know, because that particular, I think, in activist circles, certain activist circles, that's known, but it's not as well known as it should be. And I want us to highlight that, because it speaks more to like what is the collective responsibility of those in this office, in this forum, basically, uh, uh, to take note of, and then best of all to be able to figure out how to take some principled action on. So if you can highlight that, and then within that, the next question is the other international players: Saudi Arabia, Egypt, UAE, etc.
Right. So I mean, let me do the international as a collective, because I think the most consequential foreign interference really has been from regional powers. The U.S. Um, had has some involvement, not necessarily with the coup directly, but I think um, U.S.'s involvement, I think, was a bit was there was no clear U.S. policy,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and I think at times where U.S. policy could have made a difference. Again, it wasn't clear, but this goes back to understanding the regional uh, players and their relationship with the U.S. Because I think that's where what is more significant.
Okay.
Officially, the U.S. Welcomed the change of government of Bashir. Um, um, uh, Through different institutions like USAID and other group, aided the democratic transition with funding, etc. This is towards the end of the Trump administration and the beginning
Right.
of the Biden administration, and it is important to, look how both administrations approach Sudan a bit differently. Um, with the Trump administration, I don't think the Trump administration really. Trump administrations was more hands off and let the regional powers. It outsourced
Right. Right.
its influence to regional powers like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates. Prior to the fall of Bashir, Bashir's government had closer ties with because of its Islamist roots with Qatar and Turkey. With the fall of Bashir, United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia played a greater role with keen on not seeing a return of Islamists. Egypt, of course, has a similar policy. Egypt probably historically is the country that has the most interest in Sudan, but really the United Arab Emirates in the past years, for a number of reasons, has been influential either in Sudan or the Horn of Africa or the Red Sea region. Um, the Trump administration, I think, was keen on officially declared its support for the removal of Bashir, but before it could normalize its relationships with Sudan, because Sudanese and U.S. relations had been cut off since the mid-90s. It really and because there were U.S. sanctions with alleged with allegations of Bashir's government of support of different extremist groups in the region. Um, U.S. sanctions had been placed on Sudan since the mid 90s. In order to remove U.S. sanctions, which I think was a key goal of the transitional government, in order to bring about foreign investment, etc. It became seemingly tied to Sudan jumping on board with the normalization process in the region with Israel. So as the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain signed normalization agreement with Israel, Sudan was also the transitional government really was pushed to do so. Even though my understanding is, the transitional government, which was a coalition of different groups, there was a difference of opinion on this. Um, but at the end of the day, to see the removal of sanctions is what so that the Trump administration really had pushed for this process, and this, I think that it was signed a couple of weeks before the actual elections in November of 2020. I mean, it was propagated as a foreign policy when though Sudan really never was important in the Arab Palestinian-Israeli conflict, but Netanyahu, once the signing to the Sudan signing to the Abrahamic Accords, tweeted about it, and that another Arab League country had just became a member, and Khartoum being the home of the 1967 Arab Summit with the three no's, no peace, no negotiation, no recognition of
No
Israel.
recognition. Right.
So yeah, it was. I mean, it was. I mean, not that these political declarations were ever fully followed, but I think
They
it
were
just
pronounced.
yeah, yeah. It became seen as a win for Israeli foreign policy. So that was the Trump administration. The Biden administration, I think depending on which department, you look at the State Department, you look at the executive. I think there were people that were keen on seeing the transition, democratic transition work, but I don't think enough effort was put on that. The the U.S. along with the EU and then with the UN may have not been as aggressive enough with the military establishment to in the military establishment to hand over power to the civilian coalition. Again, I think for most of the 2 years, it just wasn't very clear what the U.S. policy, what was um, driving U.S. Policy on Sudan. The EU, I think, which was more clear on the issue of migrants and refugees. That goes back to an agreement that the EU had established with the Rapid Support Forces, with the Sudanese government to manage migrant flow through Libya and then and to Europe. But again, I mean, just to bring it back to the whole regional and international influence. Um, the Arab Gulf countries, I think, were very keen on not seeing a return of Islamist forces to power in Sudan. Bashir, in his final years, had established the Rapid Support Forces, and I should have explained that a little bit more about the Rapid Support Forces earlier, which is the paramilitary that the army used in its fighting in Darfur in 2003, mainly made up of Arab nomadic groups of Darfur. Um, the Bashir government had lended rapid support forces fighters to fight in the war in Yemen.
Right.
And they were rewarded. Soldiers were rewarded handsomely. 15, 16-year-old soldiers being paid, $500 a month. Um, you know, um, this is what beefed up the capacity, the military and economic capacity of the RSF. Um, um,
They were also paid to intervene in Libya too, to a degree, if I
and
remember
absolutely,
right.
yeah,
Right.
absolutely. I mean, Libya is another. I mean, Libya, the Rapid Support Forces, along with some of the Darfur rebel groups, fighting on different sides of the conflict in Libya. It's important to understand not only the military but also the ethnic and tribal um, links throughout the Sahel, from Sudan all the way to Mali, and how that played out in Libya. But yeah, these I mean the Rapid Support Forces became a paramilitary for hire, whether being fighting in Yemen or in Libya. It rose from an initial 20,000 fighters, again made up mostly of nomadic groups in Darfur, to rivaling the Sudanese army with roughly 100,000 fighters. It became an enterprise of its own, with its own business, recruiting fighters beyond the nomadic groups of the Arab nomadic groups of Darfur to other regions of Sudan and abroad, especially with groups that have where they have these transnational connections all the way to through Chad and through Niger and Mali. Um, So the RSF became closely linked with the policy objectives of the United Arab Emirates in Sudan and in the region. Um, Much of that is linked to resources such as gold, um, um, the food security is a big concern for countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And so land grabs in Sudan and in the region, in Ethiopia and so forth, became a, 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 a part of policy objectives and the protection of those acquisitions. It was seen through allies like the Rapid Support Forces. Um, I think maybe two more issues, and not to get too much detail, but I mean, Russia also has its interest
Hmm.
either directly or through the Wagner Group. Russian authorities have been a part of uh, you know, the Sudanese military, the army, has its historical relations with Russia, and that's where it gets its weapons from. At the same time, through the Wagner Group, it established its ties with the Rapid Support Forces, especially given that the Rapid Support Forces has its roots in Darfur and Western Sudan and in the border areas of the Central African Republic and Chad and throughout the Sahel, where Wagner Group is active. So Russia, has speaks to two parties, even with the current conflict. Um, um, it has connections with that and interest in gold issues. Um, Egyptian interest in Sudan. I mean, there are a number of issues, but I think mainly water security and who controls the Nile and issues of Nile talks, and then depending on who in the Sudanese, the complexity of Sudanese political forces, Egypt allies itself with the objectives, it's mostly with the army, but and in doing so, in opposition to Ethiopia's interest in the country and who it allies with itself. So Ethiopia and Egypt's main interests have been who better secures whose outlook on water talks. So you think of water, land, agriculture, gold. The interest of different countries, I think, is shaped by that. One last thing, because I think this is an issue that has gained a lot of attention in the past few weeks. Sudan has a coast on the Red Sea.
Hmm.
Um, Red Sea security nowadays with the Houthi Ansarullah targeting ships that are heading towards Israel. Red Sea security is an issue, I think, and especially in the U.S. today, I think, is paying more attention. From what I understand, policy circles on the role that Sudan could play um, in Red Sea security, which could possibly mean um, understandings with the military establishment, the army, because Sudan has, Port Sudan, the Sudanese government that was deposed in Khartoum at the beginning of the war is on the coastal city of Port Sudan. Russia and the United Arab Emirates for the past few years have been competing to have some control of a port on the Red Sea in Sudan. But at the moment, it's not clear where any of those discussions are going. But yeah, Red Sea security also is a part of the interest of foreign powers.
You've opened up a whole host of things. This is
Yeah.
why we need we need a series of conversations to touch on this. And what do I mean so folks in our audience, know? Since how would you put it? Since the overthrow of the Gaddafi regime in Libya, uh, we've seen a tremendous amount of uh, forces, some labeled Islamic, some are just, I would argue, are just adventurers, mercenaries for hire, that have been wreaking havoc across the Sahelian region, basically since 2011. And that has prompted more intervention on behalf of AFRICOM. And AFRICOM is the new strategic command that the United States set up during the Obama administration. I can't remember officially during the Obama administration. I can't remember what exact year, maybe 2010, somewhere around that era. Um, uh, and some of the backdrop around that, it's really this wave of incursion and disruption has resulted in a whole wave of um, coups and counter coups and massive upheavals, uh, in Mali, in Central Asia, African Republic, in Chad, Burkina Faso, uh, um, deeper off into Algeria, some destabilization in Tunisia, and ongoing conflict in Libya. And that's kind of spilled all the way over, not only into the Sudan, but also now increasingly into Ethiopia with its kind of ongoing civil war, on and off again civil war, most of the last decade. But how that's ramping up with now the current Ethiopian government um, intervening in a longstanding dispute in Somalia by kind of giving some tacit recognition to the Somaliland movement, which is the movement for some fractions of it is calling for a movement of independence, and what they're trying to do is gain their own particular access to a Red Sea port by granting them or a faction of them recognition. But another player that who's kind of intervening in that, who you did mention, is Turkey, and Turkey's setting up all these military bases and operations and intervening in this field, most particularly in Somaliland, but with an eye towards kind of establishing a base throughout the region and trying to, as I would consider it, um, that being Turkey, Saudi Arabia, UAE, to a lesser extent, Iran and Egypt, kind of sub-imperialist powers, which sometimes we'll sing and dance, according to the dictates of the U.S. or the EU, but they do so, in the interest of whoever's kind of in power at this particular point in time. So sometimes the allegiances, shift as you mentioned here, um, Ismail. But I just want folks to grasp how complex. It's going back to what I was saying, how complex, this whole thing is, and not, just so easy, kind of cut and dry. And even the case around the South Sudan. So yeah, that I was involved in political formations that at one point supported the South Sudan movement, only to be deeply frustrated once the independence was kind of achieved, to just see it kind of fracture into civil war, and also just make many of the same kind of neo-colonial mistakes that almost all the other kind of independent African states have ventured into basically since the 1940s. Um, but one piece that we haven't touched on, that you alluded to, and that I'm saying this just for our audience around the institute, which is always really trying to hone in on the deep ecological and climate dimensions of this, and there is one here. You mentioned two factors: there's water, which has been a long-standing issue in the region, but also a piece which is not being touched upon is the land grabs and what that's about, and how um, the one of the key factors that led to the so-called Arab Spring was one deep economic crisis on a global level, but also a deep drought, and deep climate events where food and breadstuffs were not being produced or couldn't be subsidized to the same degree. And this whole rush around these sovereign wealth funds and things like that, which are doing these major kind of land grabs. It's not often really touched upon around the link around climate. So I wonder if you could touch on some of that just a little bit, so for our audience's understanding, Ismail.
So, excuse me. Um, Quickly, just on Turkey, because yeah, I did fail to mention Turkey, but Turkey does play a role in all of this. Turkey had a close relationship with the government of Omar al-Bashir. Many of the members of the deposed ruling party of Bashir are now in Turkey, and it has become the hub for much of the information, disinformation on the war that is in support of one faction, the army, um, and because the conflict, which one dimension of the conflict that hasn't been, I think, deeply analyzed is the role of the deposed government. And in support of this conflict, in its opposition to any real transition. As I mentioned, the removal of Bashir did not mean the removal of the government of Bashir. And many of the members of his party, I think we're trying to find a way to come back in a new format. There are those who accuse those members so many of them are based in Turkey. Turkey and to a degree Iran has been supporting the army in this conflict with weaponry, etc. On your question about climate, the role of climate change and land grabs, the war in Darfur 2003 has been described as the first climate change war of the 21st century. The intense desertification and the encroachment of the Sahara into grasslands, the savanna grasslands, and what that did to the its impact on the relations between nomads and farmers, I think was key in and when we talk about nomads and farmers and how that those professions intersect with different ethnicities, um, it had an important angle, important part in igniting the fighting that we saw in Darfur, and we see this throughout the Sahel in northern Nigeria and Niger, between different groups, farmers and nomads being affected by climate change. So that definitely the issue of climate change has been a part of the ruthlessness of the RSF, if I can use that word,
Mm-hmm.
in the which was formerly known as the Janjaweed, uh, in the wars in Darfur in the early 2000s, which corresponds to issues of climate change. The Arab groups in Darfur are typically nomads. The non-Arab groups for Zaghawa um, are typically farmers. Um, Issues um, of access to water to arable lands, let alone old colonial land laws that didn't look favorably upon nomads in census and so forth. This is just the background.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
recruitment of the RSF the Janjaweed, from those communities, they came with their own legitimate issues. But the ruthlessness of the fighting has a lot to do with some of these issues that are tied to climate change. Of course, there are also political issues of marginalization, central government, racism, legacy of slavery, all that. But the climate change is has a role in conflicts in Sudan, whether locally or we've seen the political tension between the governments of Sudan, Egypt, and Ethiopia over Ethiopia building the Grand Renaissance Dam and the push for a new Nile Waters Agreement. Um, I mean, just as a layperson in Khartoum, in the past few years, during the dry season, the flow of the River Nile was so low at times where you could actually see the bottom of the river, and talked to different Sudanese, and you said they would never seen something like this before. Um, so definitely, the water, climate change, all of that, I think, is a part of political instability in Sudan. On the issue of land grabs and acquisitions, and I would invite you to invite my friend Dr. Nasreen Al-Amin, who teaches at the University of Toronto, who her specialty, her PhD is on land grabs, UAE land grabs in Central Sudan, and who could probably do more justice on
Mhm.
this issue. But for the past few years, Gulf states have been concerned with the issue of food security and the future of energy, with different energy markets trying to move away from oil to new sources, uh, how that will impact the economies of the Gulf states and what that means for the future of their food security. Um, Gulf states have been looking to acquire land in places like Sudan, Ethiopia, and elsewhere. What that means for local farmers, ownership, and how that plays out locally, politically, and support from abroad by Gulf states. That definitely is a part of the part of the formula, of the equation, that we're seeing today. I mean, there is a reason why. I mean, according to many reports, that the UAE um, is supportive of the RSF or those who support its objectives in Sudan.
One final question for me. I mean, I got a lot more.
Yeah, this
Um,
is
a lot more. We'll pick this up. I know Nasreen, and definitely was going to reach out to do kind of more of a series around this. But one question for you, and it's probably probably the most frustrating question, but it's one that I think needs to be and addressed. I don't know about answered, but addressed. We're a year into this now. Where do you see this going? Is there an end in sight? From where I'm sitting, it does not appear that there is one, but I'm hoping I'm wrong. But your thoughts?
I'm not optimistic. I mean, I share the same view. I think we are witnessing the unraveling of the Sudanese state. Um, Even if there's a ceasefire, even if the fighting ceases, practically the army controls a part of the country, in the east and the north, parts of the center. I don't think the fighting will stop until the army. I don't think the army will stop any campaign until it regains Khartoum, the capital. But Darfur and the west is largely controlled by the RSF. There's one holdout, the city of El Fasher. I mean, as we speak, There is intense fighting in the city of El Fasher, which is the capital of Darfur. Um, it, we're likely to see another massive um, massacre, just like the one that happened in El Janina last year, which is in West Darfur. Um, Different communities in Darfur that witnessed fighting had all fled to the capital city of El Fasher, and what happens, I think, is going to be decisive. But it looks like we'll see a Libya-like situation where one faction, the army, controls a part of the country, the rapid support forces controls another part of the country. In addition, you had one rebel movement, the Sudanese People's Liberation Army North. That's the SPLA North in the state of South Kordofan, the Nuba Mountains, which is in the southern uh, Sudan, Southern Republic of Sudan, not the Republic of South Sudan. I know this is all a lot of similar names and so forth, but I'm not very optimistic. I don't even and then the civilian forces. I think, which with coalitions, there's always coalitions are hard to manage, and with different views and different opinions on how to go forward. In the coming weeks, we are supposed to see a founding conference of one civilian coalition, the Taqaddum, which is the coalition of democratic forces. I'm not sure if they will be able to either finally fully establish themselves, but the fighting has led to deep social divide in Sudan. Uh, um, every community in Sudan is militarized today.
Mm.
Along ethnic and tribal lines, regional lines, self-defense um, militias, even in areas where there have been no fighting. I've been in contact with relatives where outside of the capital, you know, where there's no trust in the army to protect them. So you have the establishment of militias, and the establishment of these militias create their own local political and economic um, dimensions, and so it doesn't look like there will be a solution anytime soon. There are talks about um, the possibility of the army and the rapid support forces going back to peace talks they had established last year in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. But whether that happens or not, even if it does happen, I think it will only be the discussion will be mostly on security arrangements. It wouldn't include civilian forces and the political future of the country. Um, so yeah, the outlook doesn't seem optimistic for the time being.
So that was my last one, but the deeper question I think there, um, I consider what happened from 2021 till now is basically part of a kind of an ongoing counter revolution
Yeah,
in many respects. And I haven't mentioned it, or we haven't mentioned it, but bringing it up now. But I think the question emerges like, has this because the piece that most distressed me is what you said is not so much that each community is now militarized to a degree. I mean, part of that sadly just makes sense, as a defense mechanism. But uh, to the degree that it's, all against all, that's a major blow to any possibility of a social revolution. At least in the immediate horizon, right? So is that your take? Is that energy basically been quelched, or is there some possibility of that it may, under the right conditions, reemerge? And I'm saying this so folks know, there's one subtext that we didn't really talk about. You talked about the trade union presence in the Sudan. Historically, the Sudan has had one of the most robust lefts, not only in the Arab world, but in the African continent. Um, a very strong left presence, various parties, communist parties, etc. Um, with all the contradictions that come with some of that historically, but I'm just wondering. I know that some of that was a backdrop to the social revolution that happened, but some of that also seemed to be a criticism, at least of some of the main left forces, about how they, over the years, made certain bargains and compromises, both with the military and with Islamic forces. But where is all this now in the midst in the wake of this, breakdown?
I'm glad you mentioned counter-revolution. I mean, in essence, I mean, when we talk about how should we understand this, how should we frame this, is it a war between two generals? Is it a civil war, full-blown civil war? Um, you know, all of that is partially true, but in essence, I think the main issue is that is at large a large counter-revolution. This is the third episode since 2019 of the counter-revolution. June 3rd, 2019, with the massacre of the sit-in, I think was the first move in the by the forces opposed to the Sudanese revolution. The October 25th coup of 2021 uh, was the second wave of the counter-revolution. This war of April 15th, 2023 was the third episode in the counter-revolution. It was by the forces that did not want to see change, did not want to see the transitional period succeed in establishing a democratic Sudan. So that I think is really not the nutshell of what we're seeing in Sudan. Um, the Sudanese political forces, left to right, have um, an amazing and frustrating ability to fragment and break down and so I mean there is not one political party, not one movement that hasn't fragmented into different factions um, on how to proceed. There was that moment, I think, in December 2018 up to April 2019 with the revolution that we saw the coming together. The Sudanese Professionals Association, which was a collective of independent trade unions, established to in parallel to the officially sanctioned Bashir government trade unions. This I think was the first time in 3 decades that we saw a genuine attempt to unite political forces and of different persuasions, left to right. I mean, um, uh, can that be regained? It's I'm not very optimistic. I think the war has it will take years before I think we see something like that again. But I mean, I could be wrong. But it's just from what I see at the moment. Um, um, the very attempt to maintain the integrity of the state seems to be the objective of many. Uh, in the past year, we've seen individuals change their political stances, and people have their own private reasons, and experiences to them and to their families. So it's again, I'm not very optimistic, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, just before we get into questions, I just want folks to know, within and so for you to know within the kind of broader ISE world, there's been a lot of study and a lot of support around a democratic, confederalism model being, practiced in Rojava, right? Um, and I know for a fact, the broad revolutionary process, the democratic experiment that was taking place in Sudan for those 2 years has not been as well studied, is not as well known, but was profoundly, at least to me in my study of it, which is far from complete by any stretch of the imagination, but it was one of the most profound experiences of the 21st century. That I don't
Resistance
think has
movement.
been studied. Yeah, I don't think was studied enough. And so, for me, when speaking of a counter revolution, I'm saying that very deliberately. I think it sent shivers, throughout the region in particular. Uh,
Yeah.
um, particularly in the wake of kind of the tremendous disappointments, if you want to call that the second wave of the Arab Spring, but the different disappointments of the first wave. This was kind of igniting a new spark, and I think that was one of the critical reasons to me, not just the Islamic regime, but a broader democratic piece. I think scared the shit more out of Saudi Arabia and the UAE than almost anything, because it their forces in pressing for democracy deep within their societies, and the contradictions that are held within there, and they're not without their disruption or troubles of folks who are agitating in different ways. So it was pretty profound, and I think worth studying. And we'll definitely bring that up if we can get Isabel back with some other folks to come in and just do a piece that gives folks a context of what was, and what can be learned from that period. It's always good to learn from these experiences, and particularly as we're looking for models on, and living practices on how to transform the world from where we are, and be in connection with others who are, seeking the same. Um, okay, so I want to open it up to questions. Easiest way, as folks know in our format, is please type your questions into the chat. Me and Ismail can both read them. I see that there's, I think, one from Barry that I've read that the Abraham Accords had a very destructive impact on Sudanese politics. Can Ismail add more to what he said about this?
Right. So this was a story that I was looking into. Did not unfortunately get to finish. I have uh, um, I think if you look into how the different states that ended up signing the Abrahamic Accords, it's more important to look at the local politics than to see this as a grand vision from some of the regional powers like the UAE or Bahrain or I mean that is in part, but I think why did Sudan sign? Why did the transitional government sign the Abrahamic Accords? Um, it signed mainly to get off U.S. sanctions and to get off the terrorism the list of terrorism sponsoring countries. That was, again, at the end of the Trump administration, and it became tied to Sudan being removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list, and the lifting of U.S. sanctions became tied to signing the Abrahamic Accords. My understanding, in speaking to some of the members of the transitional government, that there was a difference of opinion and heated debates on this. Again, it's a transitional government, it's a coalition. You have people coming from different backgrounds, different outlooks, either people who represented political parties or individuals, because this was supposed to be a a um, a, a bureaucratic government that included members from the diaspora. So there were different people with different outlooks on this. It I don't think it need the signing of the agreement um, ignited a huge response on the streets that it would have normally done in the past, mainly because the general mood was that Sudan needed to get off after 25 years. It needed to get off. That doesn't mean that they everyone was agreed to it. But I think the idea is like, Sudan needs to get off this list, so financial transactions can happen, so investment can happen, all of those immediate. The signing of the agreement didn't mean the establishment of relations, because I think that those final steps never took place, and I don't think they'll take place, especially now. There's a discussion on Sudan and the Abrahamic Accords before April 15th, 2023 with the war, and before October 7th, 2023 with the war in Gaza. I think political calculations and the political actors are different. So, I mean, I think you have to look at what led to the signing, and then where is it now. But I think at the moment we, it's a signature on paper. It never really, I think, led to anything. It hasn't led to relationships between government of Sudan and Israel. I mean, just to add one more thing, Netanyahu, the government of Israel, I think we're all. I mean, their interest in Sudan is secondary. Sudan is not a frontline state. It's easier to say that an Arab League, the idea of an Arab League member state signed makes for good politics for Netanyahu domestically. There is one issue that I don't think receives a lot of attention, and I think is why the Israeli government wanted to sign with Sudan is the issue of Sudanese asylum seekers and African asylum seekers in Israel. There are today, at one point there were 60,000 African refugees, asylum seekers, and Israel that entered the country between 2005 up to 2013 that were never given refugee status, that were never mostly Eritrean or Sudanese, but also from other countries. And Israel had been trying to get rid of them or deport them to other countries. A signing of an agreement with Sudan, I think, would have allowed for the government to be more aggressive in deporting the various African asylum seekers in Israel. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one dimension of the signing of really forcing Sudan, the Sudanese transitional government, to sign those accords. It's another topic, but yeah, that I mean, again, I mean, in the idea of looking at local politics, I think is key.
Mm-hmm. You got two other questions. Can you speak more about the methods of the revolutionary movement and their particular vision for participatory democracy is one, and then the other one was what does the U.S. government want to accomplish there? And so then why is this nearly unmentioned in the news, say for democracy now?
Right. So by the revolutionary movement, I mean, there are different political actors in Sudan. I think most have been keen on the idea of reaching a place where you can have a democratic government. Um, um, by revolutionary movement, different groups would describe themselves as revolutionary movement. So you have the resistance committees that were neighborhood committees that helped in mobilizing for the Sudan revolution. Its members belong to politically to different groups, whether it's the Sudanese Communist Party, whether um, some of the traditional parties like the National Unionist Party or the Ummah Party. Um, but I think there was a general agreement on that how to establish a democratic government. Again, with people with different groups with different outlooks on how to do that. Um, the resistance committees, I think, which was a unique experiment in Sudan, and as you alluded to, I mean, when we talk about grassroots democratic organizing in Sudan over the past few years, um, um, the idea that these neighborhood committees could bring people, activists of different political outlooks together and to mobilize the streets and push for um, civilian rule for and the full transformation to civilian rule. I think, as you said, hasn't received adequate study. That there have been some papers here and there, but it is a distinctive experiment, I think, of the past for the past years on the continent and in the region. Um, that I mean, I can't. I'm I come to this as a journalist and try to not as necessarily a member of the resistance committees, but the resistance committees you can say the various resistance committees which represented different neighborhoods and cities and I think different committees had different visions of how they saw democratic transformation, but at the end in their intense and heated discussions and debates, I think we're able, up to before this war, to come to an outlook of how they saw how the authority of the people, that's sort of the shab, the translation of a document, how they envisioned. Again, these are people that activists of different political outlooks, but I think that is one. I think maybe in future discussions that you're going to somebody from the resistance committees, I think who could get into that in more detail better than I. um, there was the second question.
What's the U.S.
Oh,
government want to accomplish, in Sudan? Why is it nearly unmentioned in the news? You say for democracy now, and then there's another one that just came in, but that was the second one.
so I think U.S. foreign policy on Sudan changes according to the circumstances and prioritizes certain objectives, again, depending on the circumstances and depending on who's in Khartoum and who it's talking to. Um, with the fall of Bashir, um, the government's official position was to support the democratic transition, and there was U.S. Support financially for that. Of course, all of that came with certain was tied to certain um, 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 to certain actions by the Sudanese transitional government. Again, with the Trump administration, it was the signing of the Abrahamic Accords, the paying off of the families of the victims of various attacks that the Sudanese government was alleged to be involved in. So we saw the paying off of the families of the victims of the USS Cole that Sudan was accused. A part of all of that, these were some of the more immediate objectives. Um, but I think for the past 30 years, when you see again the various changes in U.S. policy towards Sudan, I think security in the region becomes the top of the list. You had mentioned we spoke about the Red Sea security. I think that is going to end up being on top of the list in the coming weeks. The U.S. again, official U.S. government official position is to support the civilian forces and to call for and between the fighting between the army and the rapid support forces. But I think Red Sea security, security in the Sahel, I think might end up being trumping uh, democratic transition support for the civilian forces. Um, that I think is something that where we, how the U.S. Special Envoy and the U.S. had appointed a special envoy only a month or two ago. How what priorities the special envoy sees, I think, is going to end up changing depending on the circumstances. But again, security, I think, is going to be which could mean negotiations with the army because of the army controls the port city of Port Sudan on the Red Sea. What that means for democratic transition, I think we're going to have to wait and see.
I think there's one last question from David. By democratic, like what was the general consistency, if there is or was one, on what that means? And they're saying it's asking through the frame of American democracy, not being democracy since corporations are individuals in the eyes of the state. We have a two-party entrenched system, right? So kind of framing within that dynamic. And I thank you for the question because yeah, what we often sometimes mean by democratic revolution can mean different things. So how would you break it down? From your perspective,
I think different Sudanese political actors will also have different visions on what does a civilian democratic government actually mean. Again, when we talk about the various fragmentations and the outlook of um, of a civilian democratic government, what does that actually mean? Do you bring in are members of the deposed government of Bashir? Are they allowed to organize? What into a party? Are they allowed to participate? Various the resistance committees, which have their outlook of what a civilian democratic government means. The various political parties, so they're competing in many visions among Sudanese political actors.
Mhm.
What role does the military play? Should the military play a role? What is the future of the rapid support forces? I think all of that. I mean, you speak to different Sudanese political actors, and you'll get different answers. Uh, but I mean, I think I mean at the moment, the most immediate concerns are um, will the state of Sudan remain a state? I mean, again,
Mhm.
I mentioned, I think we're witnessing the unraveling of the state. And that and it could lead to the creation of three, even four states. Um, so the idea of a civilian democratic government may be, for some people, not the most immediate concern. What does this mean for security on the ground, especially when we're talking about an unraveling famine in the country? Um, this is the dry season. Once the rainy season starts, this. I mean, there are many factors, I think, uh, consider, but the most immediate, if you asked most Sudanese on the ground, the two most immediate issues are security and food. Um, um, that what future do civilian democratic forces play in the country again? Um, and that's something I think we'll see in the coming weeks of if they are able to establish a a form of coalition. What role does that coalition play, if any? Again, uh, like for the past 60 years, Sudanese politics ends up being dictated by those who have guns and tanks.
One thing we haven't mentioned that's a backdrop, I'll just say to this last question, um, and not that everything should be viewed through this lens, but at least for understanding the macro dimensions of what the United States is looking at is competition with China. Um, and that played a major role in kind of the settlement of the South Sudan question
Yeah.
around the exploitation of oil. So I just want to factor that in as just a factor of some stuff to study, to look at and examine relative to the U.S. position. But I also think it's safe to say, you correct me if you think I'm wrong on this, Ismail, but outside of a general competitive and security framework, the U.S.'s policy, both under the last 8 years, if you want to call it that, under Biden and the 4 years with Trump, has been extremely incoherent when it comes to Africa in general. It's been extremely incoherent, and some of that argued incoherence has played itself out and is playing itself out. In the ethnic cleansing that we're seeing, it's very clear that Biden was using an old framework and an old calculus around what they call the rock steady or whatever term they like to use over in his cabinet, support of Israel. And it's clear he didn't do enough real political calculation of how uh, the nature of this right wing government that's running Israel and what its objectives are and how it is playing and can play the Biden administration on many accounts. What I think with Netanyahu in particular and his forces, they're very deliberately trying to impact the U.S. Presidential elections and congressional elections, for that matter. And I think they're going to have a lot of success in doing so. But I think there's the U.S. domestic politics, and then there's what the U.S. ruling class basically has some alignment on, despite all of their differences. And they're both definitely united that the major threat to them is China, and they're blocking wherever they can or intervening wherever they can. Uh, um, in this new kind of scramble is one of the key things that's shaping their policy towards Africa, as incoherent as it's been. But we're at 4:30 and we typically stop. I want to give you the last final word. Is any final thoughts before we close on out?
Um, Again, I mean, first of all, thank you for organizing this, and I understand that there are a lot of details that maybe some of the viewers, participants, I mean, are not aware of, but Sudan is complex, and I think perhaps a series of discussions on this, I think, will let people have a better understanding. Um, what's happening in Sudan can't be seen in isolation of what's happening in the African Sahel, and then, of course, on the Red Sea. I mean, Sudan's location puts it at the junction of the Middle East, North Africa, the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, and all that is happening in these different regions are affected by and affect what is happening in the country. When I spoke of security, to be more even specific, the idea that Sudan becomes a vacuum state, I think, is really the greatest concern. I think for U.S. policymakers, that it becomes another Afghanistan or Somalia at this location again, Sahel, Red Sea, the Horn, and the Middle East, and what that means for policy in the region. Um, I, um, you had asked me earlier a question of, for those who want to follow on Sudan to um, be updated on Sudan, and I can send you a link. Um, there are, I think, humanitarian groups that have been working on Sudan. I think most notably the emergency response rooms, which is grassroots groups actually working on the ground that came out of the resistance committees, who have been in contact with different um, donors, whether Sudanese diaspora organizations or international groups, but they have been working tirelessly on the ground, getting aid, food, internet, electricity to people in different parts of the country. There are a number of nonprofit, independent media groups like Ayin, which also have been, I think, producing some of the best reporting that I've seen on Sudan. I mean, one of the issues is the lack of adequate reporting on Sudan, and there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, not enough journalists right now, uh, internet, electricity issues. Of course, the concern for other conflicts around the world, Gaza, Ukraine, etc. But I can definitely send you um, um, information about groups, and hopefully, I mean, the discussion on Sudan, I think, should continue. Again, this is the largest displacement, the largest number of displaced persons in the world today, close to 9 million people. The official number of deaths is 15,000. It's probably triple that number. We don't have accurate information on what's happening in Sudan. But again, thanks for those who have participated. Thank you, Kali, for organizing this, and we should continue this discussion.
All right, thank you. We will, and definitely send those resources along. I'll pass them along ASAP, and make sure when we put this video up, we'll include those as links for folks to follow up. And I definitely want to have you back, Nasreen, and some other folks, that you might recommend. Let's set it up for another time next month. I think we can do a couple of part series on this. And we'll be doing we're doing a piece next month also about Palestine. It's going to be very focused on the ecological dimensions of, what's taking place, and what a reconstruction may look like, depending on what the outcome of this ultimately is going to be. But I want to let everybody go. Thank you, Ishmael, for participating and joining us today. Thank everybody for listening in, tuning in, contributing. Much appreciated. And spread the word. This will be up online soon. And encourage your family, friends, cooperators, and comrades to watch and get educated and try to put in some work. So I thank you and see everybody soon.